Hello, ladies and gentlemen. It is another episode of Crow's Nest, and I'm here with my crow. What's up, Veek?
Hi,
How you doing, dude? How is it today? How are things?
it's great, except I'm a little bit sick, so I might not be audible very much, but that's fine. We're still here to show some progress. I've been working a lot on Antikythera, and
Yep.
so were you working on some of the design stuff, right?
Yep. Concepts and some data entry and stuff for our first game's first race. It's all very hush hush. We're not talking about the specifics too much. Obviously, we have shared a couple of ideas or units or whatever, like little sneak peeks and tidbits throughout this podcast and in other formats as well. But yeah, I was actually looking forward to, for example, showing off a render of the town center of the first race. However, I have noticed that my render output settings in Blender. This is a total aside and not planned at all, total tangent. But Blender does not give me the same level of rendering options as our homie Balethal is his username, and he's one of the guys who's helping with art for our games. And he has an NVIDIA GPU and has access to thus completely different render outputs. So my renders will never look exactly like his renders. So I have a feeling that, like, what we observed basically is that there's a lot of noise with the Cycles render engine, but that's the one that we want to use. But there's not nearly as much noise when Balethal renders it out. And so now I have to find some way to, like, okay, maybe I could just get it most of the way there and then offload it to him and he can render it out himself. But, like, obviously that adds another step and he's not as available as I am to work on stuff like this. So pretty frustrating to
Yeah.
deal with Blender in that sense. But obviously it's not Blender's fault per se. It's just like, it was confusing to realize that the reason why I couldn't make mine look as good as his is just because, like, I had no options. Like, how would I know what options he had? I would have to, like, watch his screen or something. So yeah, it was a bit silly to find that out, but yeah. So we're waiting until he can get around
What
to
they
rendering.
could have done better is actually allow you to denoise properly, because when we tried denoising, it was actually too smooth, so...
Yeah,
And
but
there's
it
no
looks.
customizability.
The thing is that on Balethal's screen on his side, he actually has denoising options from what I remember, whereas I just don't. Like, I can only specify a few, right? Because so, like, I can specify some presets, but I can't control it. But it might also be like my version of Blender. There are many different silly things to do. So.
Well, I don't know. I have some version too, and it's the same, but maybe it's some hidden tab or something. I don't know.
Yeah, so we still have to investigate that. A lot of what we've been doing in Blender actually is, like, basically discovering how to hook up materials. It's like discovering how to use the Smart UV project and stuff. So make sure that our materials are actually aligned correctly and yada yada yada. So I suspected many times that there would be a lot of, like, hidden flags and hidden things that you do, and once you do them, like, everything looks so much better. And indeed, that is what happens. So we'll get there. We'll just find the rest of the hidden stuff that's buried within Blender and, like, maybe is on a 300 view YouTube video with text to speech instead of an actual commentator. And then, like, we'll figure out how to do all of this stuff eventually. But that's the price you pay for trying to use Blender, bro. So.
Yeah, when we hooked up the first texture, we were actually pretty amazed how much of a difference that made.
Yep. Yeah, instead of using basically, like, noise texture materials, and we're actually using real textures. Although the textures are from a free site, they're not ours. So we'll make that qualifier.
License, but
yeah. So, but the interesting thing about that is I still think we can make changes to it, or use it in a funny enough way or whatever, in a way that's, like, slightly different and slightly more specific to our use case. It's really, like, I find that you can have, for example, a lot of the models before I got into modeling. So that's another thing that I've been doing since the last episode, is I've been really heavily into, like, hard surface modeling and then also reference modeling from reference images. And we won't yet know how good, like, the results are. Like, I'm trying to use, automatic weights a lot of the times for animations, just because, like, actual weight painting is a little beyond me right now. I mean, I can do it, but it's not very good and it's not very easy. So I'm still learning a lot of things, right? And Blender's a program that you can do so many different things in. So like, every time you pop it open, you're kind of testing, like, a different set of skills. You just don't you don't even know what you're going to test yet. You just walk in and you're like, all right, I know I have to do this. So how do I do this?
It doesn't help that Blender is so generic, where it allows you to do, like, everything on every panel, and it doesn't, like, help you in any way. It's just like you're thrown into deep water and you have to somehow learn to swim.
Right, but it's like, you know, when you walk over to this task, it's like, or swim over to this task, like the waves are moving in this pattern and you have to anticipate those, and, you know, like however you want to take that analogy. But, and, you know, I still suspect that if you actually had good UI, and by that I mean like, you almost had like a plethora of tasks that you knew that were kind of common, like, you know, you just want to make a hard surface model, you want to make even, or, you know, a reference model from a reference image, you want to make like all this stuff that like happens all the time. If you could set up presets for that in Blender, and then, you know, you click that, like, oh, this is the task I want to do, and then it gives you like, you know, maybe a few options of layout to pick from, but like, you know, layouts that high efficiency people use or something, or even just like generic defaults that were slightly better for like the specific task, you know, cultivated for that. You know, that would make sense, right? Like, okay, now I know that I'm like trying to do this thing. Obviously, there is some gray area. There is some like wiggle room because you don't always know, oh, is this thing actually related to what I'm trying to do? Or like, you know, is this thing exactly hard surface modeling, or is it animating, or is it posing? You know, like there's things that where the like you want to be able to cross over and do multiple things. So maybe it would just end up being the same thing. But I do feel like that would be easier to learn in an environment where like they hide some of the tools that are completely unrelated to you. Like you say, in every single panel, you can access many different things. So it's a little confusing, and there's very many buttons. Like one thing that I always get from people who are talking about Blender is that they always say it's overwhelming. And I just don't think it has to be that overwhelming. So that would be a solution that I would be interested in seeing people play around with. But like really, when you try to learn Blender, you're really like looking up shit on YouTube and you know, in my case, like DuckDuckGo or whatever, just searching shit. And it's like, let me just find a bunch of people who are doing the thing I'm doing and learn from them, because there's no way in hell I'm just going to like organically learn it from like messing around with the program. So there's an element of stuff that you organically learn, like techniques for how to model or whatever, but you're not going to learn how to like do something technical that way. So definitely something that I've had to deal with. But
I think there's an interesting lesson to learn from games because they are actually competitive. And when you see like the first games like Brood War, they actually had really terrible hotkey setups like P4 Probe. But like people actually want to compete, so they actually have optimized stuff along the way. So like you will see like left-handed hotkey setups for most people because they're just more efficient, and like it doesn't seem like Blender has figured that one out. No, neither they really figured out how to make it intuitive and simple.
You know, this reminds me of a point that I was making to Bailithal, funnily enough, when he was talking about how he was just getting completely destroyed by some issue with performance or whatever. It's probably some misconfigured thing on his project's end that was causing the lag for real-time rendering or something. But you know, he's got a pretty beefy system, so like whatever he did feels like it shouldn't have had such an effect. And I remember thinking, like, you know, irrespective of whether this exact case is downstream of Blender being bad, or is it just like, you know, a user error, right? Broadly speaking, because of how important Blender actually is to the pipeline of like modern games, you would think that, and maybe this actually does happen and I'm just not aware of it, but you would think that like every big game firm, every big game studio out there would have like a small group of programmers dedicated to like forking Blender, since it's open source, and just like fixing it and making it like, or like, you know, tailor making it to whatever their pipeline is, like an Unreal Engine version of Blender, or I don't know. Like you'd think there'd be something like that, but in actuality, there's not really like, no, it doesn't seem like anybody is out there actually doing that. Maybe they're just not sharing the code.
Blender has Python plugins, and that's what people usually do, which is embarrassing.
Yeah, well,
slow and not robust at all.
Don't you love Python, Veeq? Don't you? Isn't that your favorite?
It's the best.
Yeah. For those who are not in the know, Python is also the language that was used for the most up-to-date version of some of the modding tools for Brood War, which obviously were
the notoriously breaking ones.
Yeah,
the ones that crash on every interaction and they corrupt.
Well, they don't crash. They send an exception or error or whatever, right? So they.
Yeah, but that crashes.
Oh yeah, true. Hitting the OK button crashed.
The amount of try and catches that I had to add while I was working on that is Which is amazing.
Next level, bro. So yeah.
Yeah.
And all because like the funniest thing is when people make tools. Like in this particular example, it's very egregious because for people who don't, this is like super tangential, but Brood War mods cannot run on Macs. But the guy who used this software, who made the software originally, made it in Python because he wanted to be able to make the mods on a Mac, even though he could never play them on a Mac. So I really don't know what was going on there. I mean, like if you're talented enough or whatever, if you're dedicated enough as a programmer to create this shit, then you would think you would just you would also be able to dual boot into a Windows machine or something instead of wouldn't that be a simpler, you're one of the only people in the whole Brood War space that even has a Mac, that even knows what a Mac is, because Brood War itself barely even runs on Macs these days. So, and even back then. So yeah, that's just so the reasons for people to create stuff sometimes really mystify me. It's always confusing. So, but
I will never understand Apple apologies, the ones that use all the infrastructure that they provide. It's just really terrible.
I can understand people using it, but the people who go to bat for them are definitely some people are just built into it. They've already adopted it, and it's easier for them to continue down that road than it is for them to turn around and find everything else. Start to work within a completely different ecosystem. If you already use an iPhone, maybe you have an Apple Watch or whatever. I don't know. That makes sense because you're just down a certain path, but the idea of people who are regularly purchasing the very next phone, even though they have the old phone or whatever. I don't know where they're getting their money from. But.
I mean, the biggest problem with that ecosystem is that it's centralized on a very scammy company. But yeah, that's another tangent that we don't necessarily want to go into. So.
Well, there was one point that I'm trying to remember the specifics of that I was going to make, and I think it was downstream of using those textures from the free license site. So, the reason why I was bringing that up is obviously we've historically, before I started getting into more modeling, and now I'm just building everything myself. When we were basically kit bashing, we were taking existing models and then editing them for our purposes. A lot of the times, you could definitely see if I showed you both the original model and the result, you would notice that there's similarities and it's the same core or something, but it would be different enough most of the time. That this has clearly been cultivated to reflect the thematic that you were going for or whatever. You know what I mean? It wasn't basically just here's my thing that is the exact copy and paste with some small changes or whatever. It was pretty significant changes to the outline, the silhouette, and obviously the materials and stuff, because it's an RTS instead of whatever it came from. So there's a lot of stuff like that that's just you would not. Despite the fact that the sources are very different and they weren't made bespoke for this one purpose, you can still see that there's been some attempt made to unify the thematics and the visuals and the art style or whatever. And I think that's really all. Obviously, it's better to just make it yourself, and that's what we started to do anyway. But it's not. It's to the point where it's people say that it's confusing to them how games can be made in such a way that it feels like they don't actually have a coherent theme or a vision or anything. I don't know if all of the art assets that are used in AAA games these days are actually made for that game. I have a feeling that a lot of it is just pulled from other asset libraries or whatever. There's a staggering amount of theft that goes on between audio and visuals, especially audio, between games in general. Some of it is commercial CDs, so it's just lazy, again, not adapting the sounds to meet the right stuff for whatever the game is. But there's also a lot of stuff where it's I'm pretty sure that wasn't on a commercial CD, but it ended up in a rival company's game. I don't know what's up with that. So there's stuff like that where it just happens. But regardless of the source of this stuff, seems to have been no effort placed into refining the purpose of the asset to reflect the purpose of the game that it's in. And so you'll end up feeling a lot of games just feel kind of generic, because even though they have all of these art assets and it took effort to configure them and place them into the scene, it still ends up feeling like a bunch of stuff you've seen before. And, there's some extent where stuff has to be familiar. We're going to have areas in our game that look kind of like cities or kind of ruined areas or what have you. And, but there's also going to be areas in our games that look like nothing you've ever seen before. And getting between those two without it feeling like there's too wide a gulf to sort of link them together, like feeling like that's a natural escalation of the setting, that's important. And you don't get that by just copying and pasting stuff, which seems to be the preferred method for a lot of game development these days. So I just wanted to make that point because that's something that came to me when I was talking about using those textures that we didn't make ourselves. Yet, despite that, by using them in clever ways and by, of course, editing them ourselves, and since they are free to do that with, it's great. We are able to make it feel like it belongs in our world instead of it just being a thing that is in our world, if that makes any sense. So shall we talk about Antikythera?
Yeah. So we have been progressing on Antikythera. We have probably the biggest thing that we achieved is networking rewrite that actually part of it is actually inputs and HUD being local, which makes it so you don't have to synchronize the information of those things for all the players, and instead you're actually only synchronizing commands, which are basically processed inputs. That allows not only for actually better networking performance, it also allows for better, more robust code base, and it's just better in many ways. Than, it definitely promises to be more stable too. We still have some remaining things to track, but we are definitely on the right path with networking.
Yeah, I can agree with that. I mean, just looking at how a lot of any like residual UI lag has gone away, and we also tested at I believe it was a tick rate or turn rate, turn size, yes, of 1, which is pretty fucking.
Which means it takes it means that every tick you synchronize the commands basically.
Yeah. And this is pretty hard to like match in other games or whatever. In my experience, it's like always longer than that. So there's like, but correct me if I'm wrong because you're obviously more informed on the technicals. But this is the same kind of thing as like the turn delay or whatever. When we set in Brood War, when we set it because it's lagging, we set extra high latency or whatever.
Yeah.
And that increases the delay between our commands being issued and our commands actually being ordered. So that is turn size, right? That's the same thing.
So the way how turns works is that you basically accumulate the process inputs of the players. So like if you select an order, that's a example of a command. And if you have a bigger turn size, that just means that the like collection process will take longer. So like the space between the commands being synchronized is longer, which basically leads to you having more delay to your inputs, but it allows you to not have fetching. And what was good from our initial testing is even though I'm in Poland and Pro is in America, we were able to play on turn size of 1, which means you technically have 1 frame of delay, but that shouldn't be noticeable. And we were still hitchless. So basically, in 40 milliseconds, the whole thing was running, which is our tick time.
Right.
So we are completely hitchless right now, which is really good.
Yeah, it's not. I didn't expect it to work at all at that level. Now, again, maybe it comes. I highly doubt it, but maybe it comes out that like the turn size being so low is actually one of the things that creates the desync. I feel like if anything, it would just exacerbate an issue that's already there because it's like updating every tick. But I don't think that's going to be a problem. I think we can probably keep that for the future.
We were able to already confirm that the input sync is not what causes the desync because the inputs for both players are exactly identical, which means that there was no problems with like synchronizing the 2 clients together.
Yep.
If that makes sense. And that means that basically the desync that we have is somewhere in the game. Might be from floating point precision, which we hasn't handled. We still have a lot of floats in the game, and I'm not exactly sure how I want to change that because fixed float is pretty bad if anyone knows what that is. And I also wasn't able to make set floating points to like a consistent format or whatever.
Yeah, the biggest thing is that it's like handled differently depending on your CPU. Is that right? Because like it's just, so it just ends up being kind of messy to think about. So hopefully we are able to get some, like there's a couple of things that are not yet confirmed as far as like how we're going to handle them. One of them is the floating point thing. The other of that is I just had it, but I am now free. Oh, it's like some of the multi-threaded stuff, which I guess we can get into now. So another thing that we recently achieved, that Veeq recently was able to do, is obviously the multi-threaded pathfinding. So there's the concept of, I believe you call it work queue, which is basically like, let's process this stuff, but wait our turn to send it to the main thread. So that way we preserve determinism. And obviously you can explain it in maybe more detail if you want to. But that's like the basic gist of it. And then we were able to, obviously Veeq was able to finish that system and then actually immediately implement it for pathfinding, which is pretty exciting because if we can actually get it to completely focus on, like completely work within multiplayer, that's reducing the CPU cost of like a single thread cost of pathfinding by a significant margin, which in theory allows us to have way more units on the map.
Yeah. So the way the work queue works, or rather, I should first state that it's actually a pretty standard thing to do. It's like a basic abstraction of what the system provides you, because what system provides you is not exactly something that you should call in the game, because like every time you make a system call, which is like creating a thread, for example, you're actually entering kernel mode, switching from user mode to kernel mode, which is actually very expensive in CPU cycles. That's also why you don't allocate memory on runtime. And the fact that the thing is, you don't want to do that. So the way this works is you allocate however many threads you need basically at the game load, and then what work queue does is those threads will wait for a task to be posted to the queue, and when that task is posted, it will execute it, and after it's executed, it will like either execute more or just do nothing. And then there are some synchronization stuff that you can do where like I will send the pathfinding request to the queue, and then at the end or before the end of the game tick, I will wait for all the tasks to be done to ensure that some weird teasing doesn't happen where the game stops to be deterministic.
Well, that's the main thing, is that like there is some data which is related to pathfinding is not constant, and as a result of that is something that we're like obviously needs to be taken care of, right? So we have to. There's a few things that are not yet kind of ambiguous. And ambiguity is something that we recently discussed privately as like a mindset thing almost, is like if you can remove or reduce the amount of ambiguity, like load bearing ambiguity, if that makes any sense. Like what, like basically like, can we make it so that there's not that much ambiguity that's like reducing our ability to actually get the job done? If the answer to that is yes, like once we sort of trying to think of like a good analogy here, but it's like, you know, you don't know what's in this cave, so you light a torch. Like if we can light the torch and figure out everything that's in the cave, then we know what to do, right? Like we know how to, like if it's safe to go in, do we have to go another path? So there's many applications of that aspect. I think if anybody is looking for some way of like making big tasks more manageable, there's loads of resources on this. There's loads of ways to do it. One of them is like splitting them up into smaller tasks, obviously. But another of which is like, in order to know which tasks to split up and what to split them up into, like figuring out what exactly they are. So like we kind of have an idea right now that there's like a few things that we need to explore and finalize, and one of those is that like constant data, the variable data that is needs to become constant somehow without like breaking the whole system, as you were mentioning. So like, if we can get that done, then you know basically multi-threaded pathfinding has no issues whatsoever so far as we can tell, and that's just one less thing that we have to worry about. So, and obviously with the floating points, it's the same thing. So it's almost like those initial problems where you don't exactly yet know immediately how to solve them are like they're almost like invitations to
Yeah.
to explore.
There's actually a pretty good video that Jordan Peterson made where he was saying where if there's like 0% chance of you actually getting the right answer the first time. So you actually ought to just explore it and see what the next step is. And even if you don't immediately see what is the right answer, at least you know what not to do, which is still useful and can guide you forward.
Yeah, that's the video. You have to be a fool to be a master, or something to that effect, right?
I think so. I will try to find it to link it in the description.
Yeah. So we're all big fans of like philosophy that actually helps you. I've been big on the Daily Stoic. It's just like an email newsletter thing you can get, and for the most part, they give you some interesting and actionable things that you can use. And since then, Raffles obviously gotten into that as well. So we're looking for that kind of functional philosophy, like to the extent that you can call yourself this when you're just a programmer or whatever, like just some guy working on a computer. Like, we're working men. We're trying to. We might not be doing like incredible heavy lifting or whatever, but we're trying to do stuff. Like, we're trying to make things happen. And like, some philosophy is unfortunately just like, ivory tower or like totally disengaged from the rest of the world. And it's like, well, if we had like infinite resources, what would a utopia look like and stuff? But like, we're more like, okay, we have limited resources. How do we use them properly and so on? So that's more of our.
I think Stoicism was historically very pragmatic.
Yeah.
Where like, if you look at like Marcus Aurelius, where he was actually like an emperor, and where he used it to abstain from like corruption and be more productive and stuff like that.
Yeah, I think if you had enough people really following those doctrines, it's not even really a doctrine, but just the philosophy of it, you could actually have, like, for real, the benevolent dictators. I mean, like, I think Marcus Aurelius, despite the fact that he's very far removed from our current history, and despite the fact that, like, to some degree, you can really only corroborate what you've lived through. And even then, it's like maybe what you've seen by your own hands. Like, you really don't know how twisted the message gets between different forms of history and different ways of explaining the issue and presenting it through the news or mass media or whatever. It's like, there's definitely going to be some things that, like, you have firsthand accounts and firsthand experience is really the only way to corroborate something, right? And so there's a degree to which that limits the usefulness of many reports and of history, broadly speaking. So to that extent, it's like, okay, what can you really do about it? But where I'm going with this is basically, you should be able to say, if even if this is like apocryphal in some way, the tale of Marcus Aurelius is inspiring in the sense that it promises that if you are just introspective and you're honest and you're trying to be ruthlessly objective about your own faults, like, it doesn't mean that you'll never be faultless or you'll ever be perfect in that sense. What it means is that you are genuinely going to, like, 90% to 95% of the time or whatever, like majority of the time you will do the right thing. And that means that you could be given immense power. And if you were really, like, able to follow this through to its logical conclusion, you would not abuse it. And that's sort of, I mean, we're only making video games, but like, there's many places where video game developers have basically chosen the Machiavellian approach towards self-enrichment and not even towards like a goal that you maybe is like pushing ahead the medium or something. I don't even know what it would be, but there's a way that you can use Machiavellian philosophy or whatever you want to call it, like methods, to not just be selfish and like sociopathic or whatever. Like, you can kind of imagine like somebody who wants to really bring about powerful social change that's going to improve the lives of people, but they use some like by any means necessary method to get it. Like, okay, maybe I don't agree with that, but I can at least see where they're coming from. Whereas like in this case, it's game developers just being like, and publishers for the most part, and investors and stuff, like, but can we continue this infinite growth machine? Can we just keep getting money? And it's like, well, if you don't want microtransactions and whatnot, then like you don't need any of that. You just get enough money to keep flowing through the doors, to keep the lights on and keep making stuff, and That's all you need. You don't need to live in complete poverty, but you also don't need to, have a million yachts either. So I just don't get the idea. I think you can actually improve, or at the very least maintain whatever the current status is in your own sector of the world. That's what I think I get from Stoicism anyway. And the way it feeds back into Antikythera development and stuff is just like, can we make stuff that actually, works? And like, is there stuff that currently doesn't work? Like we were talking about with the floating points, like we were talking about with the pathfinding, and yeah, can we get that stuff taken care of? So I think we can. And obviously many people before us have. Like, there's actually one example, the player HUD and input overhaul, which we already talked about, that's basically how most as far as I'm aware, that's how most RTS games, most lockstep games handle it anyway, is like they have a lot of stuff that's local and they have a command buffer and they send that. So even though that was like a big change for us, it was also like stuff that many other people have done. It wasn't like reinventing the wheel. And I think that's useful to know that, like, it's not like
we were exploring, but we came back to this basically.
But the other thing too is that, like, it's good to know when you've done it's good to just know when something you're doing is actually the first time somebody has seriously attempted it or whatever, or like succeeded in it and stuff. Like, if we know that like we're pretty sure that some of the game ideas we have are totally unique conceptually, and that means that we're not sure if it will work execution wise. But as far as making an engine goes and making like programming work for us and the computer do the thing that we want it to do, that is like
computer did the work.
Yeah, make computer do thing. Like, we can do that. Like, people have done that for a long time, and ideally we do it to a degree that's more robust, more less error prone, and more functional and performant than other people who have come before, or yields a better outcome in terms of like the concepts that we're executing on. But like, we have some faith that because we've done this, because we're not the only people to have ever made an RTS engine before, then that's fine. We cynically, some people who have very, shall we say, extreme views on the subject may claim that we are the only people to make an RTS, but even I would not say that. And I like to be pretty extreme in my headline grabbing. You know what? This is another aside, but I actually think that, like, especially in the modern day where there's all this like rage baiting and stuff, there's part of me that wants to avoid ever having like a crazy headline that's like, local man says that Brood War is the best game ever and it's still bad or something. I don't know. Like, I've said that before, and it's like, on the one hand, I can see why that would be tiring to people for sure. But on the other hand, right, it's like you kind of want to draw people into some like, the utility, again, maybe the Machiavellian utility or something of like, making people say, what the fuck? How is that even true? And then them having to like, they have to dig through, right? They have to like actually, they feel compelled to explore this idea to a greater degree. And then maybe, hopefully, what that turns into is, oh shit, like now maybe I have my mind changed about something. Unfortunately, the side product of that usually ends up being a lot of people being outraged. So there's probably some way to do that in a way that isn't terrible. But
when there was 20 years without a game that was noticeably better than Brood War, then you sort of want to start to crowpill people.
Yeah, well, yeah, it's something that people have noticed that very many consumers or whatever have like a tough time accepting that a lot of people do things badly, right? There's a point that a community member, Fagudo, made on the Discord server, is that like, you look around and there's a lot of stuff done badly in terms of like, objective quality or whatever. And so it's not really a huge stretch to say, guys, this is bad. Most things are bad. Like, maybe people think of it as like a black pill, as it were, as like, oh, this and this depressing, that most things are bad. But I mean, as a creative, I just look at that as like, okay, I don't have like I forget what it's called, like the famine mindset or whatever. I have like the abundance mindset where, okay, many things are bad. Well, then easy to set myself apart, right? Just do something that's good. I think of it like that. And as a consumer mindset, like obviously that means that maybe I enjoy games less than other people do, but it means that, I can look to other mediums. Like I've rediscovered books this year. Not that like, I say rediscovered or whatever, but like I've started to read books this year, and obviously I watch a lot of good movies. But I can also push people to the point degree that I, as a consumer, have some input and some power. I can push developers to try to make things better, right? And to go down a better path. So there's many things that you can still do. It's not like you're powerless. You just, maybe have to put in a little bit more effort, and you definitely are going to want to see what you can accomplish as far as like making, I don't know, like if you're actually a creative person or you're making stuff like as a game developer, then see what you can do to push things in a better direction. Maybe you can't completely remove the fucking microtransaction model out of a game when you're in like one of these AAA titles, but within your job, what can you do to make this less of a Skinner box, less of some psychological trickery? What can you do to make sure that whenever the player engages with what you made, what you did, like they have a genuinely good time? And if enough people do that, and like eventually that is the change,
I think once you get essentially crow-pilled, you really stop enjoying the poor stuff, but you grow an incredible appreciation to when something is actually great.
Mm-hmm.
The problem in the game space is that we don't have really masterpieces yet. We have that with film and with books, but not with games. Not really.
Yeah, to the degree that there are masterpieces, like Jonathan Blow said this in the 3rd episode of our time together, and he mentioned that like if you really like one of the Final Fantasy stories, then he can make recommendations for you to recalibrate your sense of what a good story is. And I think that's a good way to think about it. It's like if you're within games, you do have to grade on a curve for like anything like story or whatever, because like a lot of it is just like poorly learned like very surface level lessons taken from other mediums and like lazily applied to games. It's like, yeah, I guess I will have this Hollywood story put into my game, even though like having camera angles and stuff like this isn't really for one, it's just not as interesting as the real actors. And for another, it's also like, why am I doing this when there could be gameplay? So like, most people just aren't applying the medium correctly. And I think you get that whenever there's a young medium, is like you have to kind of explore what this thing even is. And so we have a good feeling of that we know what it is. So we're not concerned about that whatsoever. But it's an interesting and fun exploration. And I feel like if more people were actually trying to do that exploration, instead of just like all of the AAA space being totally co-opted by like the infinite growth machine mindset, and everybody in the indie space more or less trying to like ape that or like be like compete with the AAA space, because look at my Unreal Engine license, like I can make a big game too. But it's like, bro, like you can't do that. Like you're not gonna, first of all, like you're probably not gonna compete because they actually have a budget, or they have a much higher budget than you are gonna have as an indie. And second of all, like why would you want to compete on those grounds, on those terms, when it's just much better to like, I don't know, like isn't it just much better to build your own thing? I don't know. That's something that has eluded me for a long time now, is like figuring out why people find it interesting to basically like cargo cult something that in and of itself doesn't actually have much of an identity. So anyway, we're a little bit off the path of Antikythera, but I think another mindset thing that is related to Antikythera that I think is going to be useful for people to know about is we talked about this maybe a few weeks ago, Raffle, but the idea that we originally, when we came up with Antikythera, we thought of it as like a platform for all of our games. And more recently,
yes,
especially you got to this realization sooner than I did because you were actually working with the code, right?
Yeah.
One sec. But it's a bit different for me because I'm just thinking of it from like a more hands-off approach, or not as much of a programming approach. But I've recently come around to your way of thinking about it, which is instead of thinking of it as a platform for all of our games, it should instead be thought of as like an initial layer, perhaps. But like Antikythera is not going to remain like, here's our version of Antikythera or whatever. Like every game is going to be a part of the same repo or something. Like no, it's more like, we're building this thing. we call it Antikythera. It's the engine layer, but like we have to customize it for each game, and we probably maybe there's going to be stuff that we have to undo from one game to
because
another.
we have different problems which require different solutions.
Even if they're all RTS games, I mean, we're planning on building games that aren't RTS games, and we'll get into that maybe later if we have time. But like the idea of having RTS games, like I think we currently plan 3 or 4 of them. So it's like, okay, yeah. Let's have all of our RTS games under one thing. Like that doesn't make any sense, bro. Like let's have all of our 2D games as one thing. Like we're all solving for different things across all of them, So it doesn't make sense to think of them as one thing. And it might sound like it's not that big of a deal as a mindset change, but when you start to realize that you're not building like your own personal Unreal Engine, but instead are like you just think of it as an extension of the game in some way, it becomes a lot easier to understand. Oh, this needs to be cultivated and specifically designed, bespoke for the one purpose. This is an artisanal, engine layer for each individual game, and we call it the same thing. And maybe that is a little silly to do now, but I think it's still fun.
It's basically our like modern's mindset, where we're really upset that like hard coded everything, and that it was really. Like we were just struggling in the code base, but
well, we have to reverse engineer everything because there's no source.
I mean, basically code is. It's not like you can soft code everything. So hard code is not inherently bad because hard code is actually performant.
Yeah,
and obviously you want data entry. You don't want to have to like compile when you like make a unit or something, but they're not like you shouldn't be writing like scripting languages or something, or like weird abstract like scale definitions or something. You should just code them and have them be performant instead of having like this generic engine solution that is like Unity or whatever.
I think it makes no sense at all to think of it like basically what you were saying. I do think that the modders mindset definitely informed us for that. I mean, there's like the OGs will know this, but we were originally thinking, let's make Antikythera open source and like anybody can use it to make any RTS game they want. And it, like soon became apparent that like maybe this is possible with other genres, but it's not possible with an RTS. Like you're solving for so many different things. Like some people want to have naval combat and mechanics like for boarding and all this other stuff. Like some people want completely different things. And like you don't want to try to be all things to all people. Like you want to make your own stuff. I mean, another thing that is maybe surprising to some people when they find it out is like we've certainly grown into building our own game concepts and coming up with compelling ideas for games. We all, especially myself, started just wanting to make like custom campaigns or whatever, like experiences. Like we didn't necessarily want to go in and build the tools to do that. Like that's why we were modders for a long time. Is like, oh, we have this like pre-built area and we're just gonna like update it until it's what we want. But when you have that, when you factor that in analysis wise, I think it's like it becomes pretty obvious that like, oh, in this particular case, it was still like we were still outgrowing our modders mindset when we decided to move away from the concept of Antikythera as like a completely separate entity that links back into every single thing and it serves as a platform. Like, no, it's more like the initial layer of all of our games, and we're going to make meaningful changes to it as things go on. But it is still helpful to refer to it separately, mostly because when we talk about like initial games or whatever, I mean, we're not really talking that much about our game. As I mentioned at the beginning, our first game is going to be a little hush hush until we get more info on it. I will say I think I've already said this before, we're making an indie fund pitch once again. We had some back and forth and talked with Jonathan Blow himself. And so we are going to make another serious attempt. And that will be most likely at the end of February. That's our sort of deadline for that. So it's coming up, obviously the shortest month of the year. But beyond that, it's like, we're not going to get to a point where like, even once we announce what that game is, we're not really going to get to the point where, hey, here's, like, there is something different about the engine versus the game is what I'm trying to get at. And like the engine layer is all of the base functionality of what an RTS needs, no matter what it is, like pathfinding and AI and networking. And all this other stuff. And then there's like, also solutions for how we're going to handle, map events, like basically triggers in Brood War or something like that, where it's like, here's some sort of like event that you have, like you want to send a dialogue event. So how do you configure that? And, we have to, that's another sort of black box that's very ambiguous right now, but we do know what we don't want. And what we don't want is like a pseudo scripting language. So we have to figure something out for that. And for our like short-term solution to that, we are just going to like hard code things like you would do in any other game. Like, oh, player goes to this area in this map, and so then this thing happens.
I actually had a funny idea that maybe I just copy paste the trigger parser from Brood War and use that for now, but we'll see how that goes.
Hey, that could work. That could be funny. Just writing like that's not really a scripting language, is it, or whatever? It's like writing pseudocode in comments. So,
yeah, but the parser is similar to scripting. It's obviously not very performant because of the nature of how interpreters work. But it could get us started, I guess, and then we can imagine what a better thing would be.
Well, that's another thing that we've tried to do, right? We've tried to just get started and then work from there.
It's a pretty robust system as far as I tested it, and it is workable and it's easy to implement and actually get feedback on. There's this like feedback loop that you want to be engaged in, so you the quicker you get results, the quicker you can pivot. So
the quicker you can make adjustments to whatever needs to be done, for sure. So I think there's a lot of value in doing stuff like that. I will say there are a few other things that we have to do short term, and this is in basically like the next week and a half or whatever. We do want to obviously quash the networking issues. So we are aware of two desyncs like we were talking about earlier. One of them seems to be like could be floating points or something else. It's in the game, and the other one is the multi-threaded pathing. So we will.
Yeah, we haven't actually talked about AI yet. So basically, there are like few other minor changes that we had. One of the bigger ones is that we started AI, so it can mine stuff, it can construct stuff, it can train stuff. So it's pretty basic right now, but it's a start. And then we also have some other small changes like shader hot loading, UTF-8, font rendering, some pathfinding improvements. I think we talked about that already. And we also have hitchless, like image loading, which is more robust. But the short-term stuff is iterating on that. We have to improve networking so we don't have to desync, and that ideally we could have more than 2 players.
Yeah, so I don't think this will make it into the content we're planning to deploy with our indie fund pitch is like, let me see. I know we wanted like a 4-mission mini campaign that's like specifically built for that. And by the way, guys, it will also be available in the actual game when it comes out. Like we'll keep it there as like a piece of history. I mean, it'll have to be updated because obviously like all of the elements of each race are not going to be implemented yet, but so there will be some changes that happen, but like it's still going to be content, so that'll be like some side story you can access. I'm not honestly, we haven't talked about this. We'll get into this probably in a separate episode, but I am totally fine with like having a decent amount of content, like, like a mini campaign or whatever, that's like you have to like find some secret to unlock. I actually like, I don't have any fucking complaints about that, because the whole idea is that like, wow, isn't this special? Like the feeling of like, wow, isn't this special, is something that you don't really get from games anymore, because games are so expensive to make now that like any amount of content, they basically need you to know that that content exists, so that like they can like get the return on their investment of like you playing the content, because they invested in making it, and it was really expensive. So like that's why when you walk down a path in like Todd of War or whatever, you just like walk into a corner and you get a secret, and it's like, yeah, well, that was really secret, really hidden. But it's like if they don't do that, then you might never find it, and then it's also really expensive to build these levels, so they can't make them too complex and yada yada. So it's like a bit silly that their process is like that. But I don't, on the other hand, like I can make content for days, like especially when we get a really efficient editor. Like we're going to continue building support for the editor and stuff. Yeah. Like once we get that wrangled, like I can write scripts, I can make content like all of this stuff, it'll be really interesting to see how quickly that can happen. And since it's my stuff in this particular case, my content for like the campaigns, and I'm sure there's going to be, especially with the idea that we can have 2 people working on the content at the same time, or whatever, multiple clients connected and on the editor side. That's pretty big too. So like, I'm sure it won't just be my content for the entirety of it, but our content, like I personally am totally fine with saying like, yeah, you have to like find all of the hidden fucking Tikimon heads or something. I don't know, like whatever that is, like you have to find all the hidden stuff to access this content. Like, great. Like that's fine for me. So it'll be interesting to see. Like that's one of those things that's actually rewarding as a designer, is like when somebody actually does find it, then like, to some degree they were probably worthy. You know what I mean? I don't know. That's a weird word to say there, but it's like they put the effort in.
It's funny how they are like the AAA games are insecure about players missing content, but then they also have so much filler in between. Like, if they actually had the game be concise, they wouldn't have to worry about that, probably.
Yeah, well, I wrote about this on my Substack, which I guess I didn't. I don't remember if I had started when we recorded our last episode. I don't think so, because it was the 3rd episode, and it was like before the end of the year. So anyway, I have started a Substack. You can check it out. I'll have it linked. And on that Substack, I wrote a piece recently about like game length being one of the main things that people care about, when it's like really they should care about like the quality of the experience. So like if it's a really long game but it's boring, it's grindy, and there's not really much engagement, like why is that valuable? Spoiler, it isn't. So how can we like correct people's ideas? I mean, I guess like game length being the main yardstick or meter stick for quality is like, that's people saying that like, hey, we want an experience that like, we don't want the experience to end so soon, so as to not be satisfying. But like, I also think that like replayable content, replayable games is just such a thing of the past for most people. Like they don't even know what that is. So they almost have this assembly line mentality as a consumer. And of course that translates to the designers as well, that like, this is here as content, whatever that term means. It's not here as like an experience. It's here as like, just experience this to whatever degree you can and then move on. Like, keep the sludge pump flowing, so to speak. Like people have noticed this with TV shows, like all the Marvel stuff is like just all the same, but it's just there so you can watch it after work or whatever. And it's not there to like enrich your life really. It's just like keep your subscription fees going and whatnot. So I think that games also suffer from this, as you mentioned. And I also think that like the answer to that is like, okay, you can have a game that has lots of content and therefore has like a long time to beat. But if all of that content is so full of ideas and full of engagement that and dynamic enough that it will change meaningfully when you play it again, suddenly, I can spend, 10 hours playing one mission across like however many times I go back to play it, and it will still be different and it will still give me something interesting in a different capacity, but in a similar way to how like you might read a book multiple times and get something different out of it each time, like if you come back later or whatever. So you were saying earlier that you don't feel like games have many masterpieces. I think another way to say that too is that I feel like you as the gamer don't get anything different from playing most games like later in life. And that's something that is really weird, because when you watch a really good movie or you read a really good book and you bring more life experience to the sort of perspective of sitting down and engaging with that media, like that will meaningfully change your experience with whatever you're doing, like reading or watching. And for a game, it's more like, as you get older, it seems more silly. Like the dialogue is more obviously poorly written and the story is more obviously full of holes, and like the world is more obviously in conflict with the narrative. Like all the only thing that you get out of it is just realizing that this game is terrible. That's the only thing you get from like getting older, So I don't really know what to make of that, but that's just sort of an observation that just came to mind after you said that. But I do think that having content that's just sort of there for people to discover, if they discover it, sort of take or leave, is that's like exciting to me, because it really is like saying, hey, if you're attentive enough to find this stuff or whatever, like your reward is an experience that has seldom been had by very few other people. And I think there's an element to that that's pretty neat. So
yeah, I think having that is good, because it's like It's an optional thing that is rewarding people that pay a lot of attention, and I think that's good to have. I personally don't think having Omnidad is good, where you're like completely like lost and directionless. I think that has potential to be really bad, but
Yeah.
it's it's definitely something interesting to have if it's like, oh, you have Digimons and you can fucking like
Yeah.
activate them and like do something weird. Like,
Well, if there's
cool.
something that like makes sense for you to develop a thought process to, like, some people will just think of it as set dressing, and maybe that's even like the default. There's a degree to which the stuff that I write has a presumed default experience that is expected. So, like you were talking about how you don't want necessarily want to be directionless, but if the default direction is play the missions, defeat the enemy, and that's
Yeah.
difficult in and of itself and engaging in and of itself, then okay, me as a player who doesn't pay attention to that stuff isn't necessarily losing out. But what you will see for sure is like a sense that people are like there's going to be some things in the world that maybe don't add up if that's the only path that you take. Like, our silly example of Tikimon, which is just like a giant Moyai head, basically, that's like embedded in the terrain. It's like, okay, if we create like a ritual altar looking thing, and there's like, corpses here of a certain unit or whatever, and it's like, I kind of recognize that unit because I know, like, I actually can train that unit, and there's like, 3 of them here. I wonder what happens if I bring 3 more sacrifices. And like, I don't know, maybe there's also some telltale signs of like Tikimon activates a laser and beams it into the ground or something. So there's like laser tracks. I don't know. Like you could have in world building and shit like that based on the set design of the level. And it's like, oh, I didn't know this was going to happen. I have to think about like how this. What does this mean? Is this just like a funny doodad, or what is the scene telling me? And most people will just gloss over it and keep moving. But if you're attentive, you might know, hey, I know what to do here. So.
Oh, that's definitely better than reading fucking item descriptions to try to make up the lore.
Yeah,
But
well,
yeah, I think the ideas that you presented here also tie into the general system that we have developed for scenarios where the dialogues and what actually happens is super organically constructed from basically what happens in the game. So like characters will interact depending on what is happening. Like what they will, it will not sound artificial. It will actually react to things in Word as if they were characters in Word. Crazy idea, right? Like
right, yeah.
If you're attacked, then your ally will probably say, maybe he will make fun of you or something. Like he would do the in-word response of that in-word thing happening,
Yeah.
right? And we sort of have that with like even Stormborn, right?
Yeah,
The
way back.
original.
An old map that I made for back when it was still called Project Hydra. So one of just a really old custom map I made for Brood War, but it involved dialogue where you would actually have people remarking that they are going to attack, and also that they've suffered losses, or that they have discovered a new enemy, or that they are, and to some degree that's almost like not. There's a degree to which that is some weird halfway in between dialogue and like a mechanism for communicating with an AI ally. But when you recognize that it's there, like there's another, like that's, so thinking of it as more like this is just a representation of my AI ally communicating with me, like an abstraction of that. If that's all you take from it, then that's fine, because you get the communication, you get good info, you like there's a small degree to which it reinforces character traits or whatever, but you might not even care about that or pay attention to that. However, if you decide to go from the route of like really paying attention to that, and if you kind of guess that actually the way this is written and the way that the rest of the world is constructed has had care put into it and has been really thoughtful and has been like, I think there's a lot of problems with the Stormborn quality of the script or whatever, but you could imagine a better version of that like reinforces a lot of the not just character themes and faction themes and real world in lore like stakes and whatnot, like what it means if they lose here, what it means if they win here. You can do all of that, and there's like a deeper theme going underneath that. Like I'm a really big fan of Stanley Kubrick. I really like that there's and to some degree, like The Witness is similar to this as well, where there's like a set of layers where like you can pierce one layer and find like another thing to think about, or like really like Kubrick is such a weird case because everything is by design, pretty much. Like there's very few like continuity errors that are like, if there are continuity errors like in something like The Shining, I'm with Rob Ager on this, where he's a film analyst and critic, and he says that like the continuity errors in the movie The Shining are actually there to give you a sense of unease. They're deliberate, and it's like I think that's definitely true because it's shocking how many there are. Like they can't have been by mistake. Like, it goes the other way, where it's like it's the opposite of like extreme laziness, because we know this guy is like super particular about stuff. So it can't have been that he just didn't care. It must have been deliberate. And there's a lot of other things to support that theory. And so I think like those kinds of examples where somebody really does have intentionality behind every single thing in the film, like if you can somehow apply that to a game, and it's hard because it's very dynamic, and like you have to intend everything that could happen depending on different stimuli. Like, oh, is the player being really successful? Then there's a different dialogue event. Is the player being, not so successful? And like, what happens if there's like edge cases where like somebody is like barely on the line between some Boolean being flipped or whatever, and then suddenly like they kind of get it, but it's not quite as good or robust. Like that's going to be a fun exploratory process that we do. But I definitely think there's a lot of value.
Definitely
in
a spectrum, right?
Yeah,
I think what makes it very great is that it's very, like, in the word justified, so it's like show over tell.
Yeah.
And it's also very subtle, where, like, it's not screaming that, like, oh, you should know that this thing is that, and, like, it's not, exposing information to you for no reason. It's not info dumping you. It's actually, like, if you see a commander that is like maybe conservative in his strategy and like his even way of speaking, where he's like super like believing into the chain of command or whatever, you can actually sort of like get those cues while playing and actually understand that character very deeply, even though you haven't really like you didn't have to open a wiki page to learn about it.
Yeah.
Like,
well,
you didn't have to read item description.
Just the act of, like, just the fact that the characters in how they are represented through gameplay and how they are represented through dialogue and plot points, just the act of not having those be in conflict is almost revolutionary in games. Like, it's just almost never been actually done. Certainly not at a widespread. Most of the time, like, people playing our game, our first game, it will be for many of them the first time they've experienced characters that actually belong in the world that they have been placed in. You know what I mean? And that's like weird to think about because we're just some people. We have no budget currently. We are all out of pocket, and like, okay, that's great. But why does it require like basically people who are not connected to the AAA space or the main industry or whatever? I don't know. Like, to me, I just think about it like, how do you even start conversations about something like this when it feels like nobody even knows what you're talking about and everybody thinks that the current solution is totally fine? So that's where I'm coming from anyway, and that's what I write about on Substack, and that's what we talk about on these podcasts. And eventually we'll need to do a lot less talking about them. I don't know that we will. I do like talking, but we'll need to do a lot less because we can just point to examples and say, here's how it's done. So I look forward to that sort of situation turning in and being there. So we have indeed crossed the hour mark, and I'm not sure how much longer you feel like giving us time, because I know you're obviously, you mentioned you're a little under the weather, but if you have any other topics for the stuff that we didn't get to that you wanted to bring up, now would be a good time. We can talk about a couple other things if it interests you.
No. I can still go for a moment. So.
All right. So I do know that we talked about how there's going to be an Indie Fun pitch, and that will be towards the end of February, by the February the latest. So the question is, what stuff do we still have to do? So we obviously plan to fix up networking so that they're totally good. Ideally, we could have more than 2 players. Like I mentioned, the single player campaign of like 4 missions, but we also want to ship some co-op scenarios, some melee maps, that people can experience on their own. And if people at Indie Fund want to play that stuff, they could certainly play it still in single player. There'll just be an AI ally ideally. So that means that obviously AI is a big deal, right? We have to make sure that the AI works properly, that everything is good for that, and that they're at least good enough to like, issue a challenge without cheating. That would be the ideal scenario. And, maybe we don't have to target super high skill because I imagine most people haven't played RTS games that actually try to like have AI that are actually trying to beat you. But it would be cool if we could achieve that level of skill. Although I'm also kind of cognizant of this because I also wrote this on Substack, but I really like Skatumesk's quote where he says, lower the difficulty by becoming better. That's like one of my favorite quotes from like the last year or so, is like, dude, actually do that, because if you just don't have a difficulty selection, then you just have to get better. But I am a little concerned about like maybe people won't even be able to beat the first mission if we adopt that, like depending on the skill level of that. But I also think like maybe that's like a selling point. Like, wow, this game actually wants me to play an RTS game. So like, that's crazy. But even still, I think there will be like the design philosophy that I have for like early onboarding and tutorials is going to support player exploration and growth. Like I've talked about this before, but it's like if you have some defensive advantage because you're on a cliff with like a small choke point or ramp, then you get like height advantage and you get like early sight and you get the ability to build like basically low APM defensive structures or whatever that will take care of your threats automatically, and then you can kind of explore from there. So if you are not very good, you can at least last a decent amount of time before you get overwhelmed, and that will give you enough sample size to actually improve if you're serious about improving, right? So I think that will do it well enough. So the next question is whether or not after the AI stuff is taken care of, obviously we talked about map events, maybe we do the trigger parser stuff, we're not sure. Yeah. And we do need behaviors for the initial implementation of our first race, like any of their unique behaviors. Some of the way that they unlock tech is also unique, so we're going to have to figure that out, but that's like linking structures together and stuff. What else do we have? Yeah, I think that's it. I mean, we're going to be doing a lot of polishing in February. Like, hopefully we can just lay all the systems down over the next few days before the end of January, and that'll be enough. But I think that should be everything for our goals. So yeah, we get into some of the mindset things as like a summary. We talked a little bit about some of these things throughout the episode, but we did want to close out talking about how something is indeed better than no thing. We had a little event where we were talking about resource areas, which is basically like a concept of like a grouping together of resources, and then
it's basically like a base. Like if you have an expansion on a map in RTS, it's basically grouping that as a concept, like one singular expo as a concept for the engine.
Yep. And for the most part, this is just used for AI. I could see it maybe being used for like auto mining, but I don't think we're actually planning on having that anyway. We can go into like some more mechanical stuff probably in the next episode if people are interested, of like what our RTS is, how our RTS is going to differ. We actually plan to get to that here, but we talked too much about other things, so owned. However, we had the example of resource areas, because it's like we need a concept of that, but Rafa was sort of like, oh, I don't really like either of the two options I seem to have for implementing them. And then we talked about it a little bit, and it's like, not only is one of those potentially bad options better than having no options, obviously, the other thing is, it turned out that like those bad options, or one of the bad options, was actually going to be scalable into the future once we iterated on it. So it wasn't even like it was a system that would have to be totally ripped out.
I had a choice between like a shitty algo for auto-making them or a shitty UI system for them. And actually it turned out that both of them could be used in conjunction, because the auto-shitty algorithm would probably be something that mappers would default to, and then they would adjust.
Yeah, so and we can make improvements to the algorithm so that the mappers have to adjust less often, but and we can make improvements to the UI so that when they do have to adjust stuff manually, it's not that painful. But it definitely was funny to think like, wait, actually, this is all useful. So sometimes it's just enough to get started on a task, right?
It's sort of funny because I actually haven't. That was actually the last thing that I worked on AI on, because then I started the netcode stuff. But the idea was still very useful, because when I was doing the netcode, it initially was a very seemingly overwhelming task because of the scale of it. But then when I started to actually pull out variables and actually just make my compiler work for me by like basically like, you can rename stuff or whatever, remove variables, and it will compiler error you, and you just go to each error to correct it in a way that is sensible to the new thing. So that's what I was doing, and then after I finished the first pass, which was like basically removing the old player input system, I was able to get clarity in my mind what is the next step, which actually was I believe it was starting to implement the command buffer, and then actually like integrating the new stuff and separating like the local from the non-local stuff. So yeah, basically each step of the way revealed the next step of the way, which is like the same as the quote that you used in the Substack article, which went, "As you're on the path, the path appears," or whatever that was, like something like that.
Yeah, so there's consistency. The consistency angle is just throwing yourself at the work, keep trying over and over, which obviously all of these end up being very linked. To the degree that they are useful when separate, I'm not sure, but the quote of "as you're on the path appears" is applicable to this, because it's just you started working on it, you figured out what needed to be done, and then literally as you were working on it, you got more ideas to continue working on it. And sometimes synchronicity happens like that, and you can just keep working, right?
There's actually another quote that I remember that relates to this, is that basically the right thought will very rarely lead you to the right action, but the wrong action, or whatever, any action really, can very often lead you to the correct thought. So it's actually better to act and then think than the otherwise. If that makes sense, because like if you like, also, I guess that ties into the 0% chance thing that I was talking about before, where like you can't really do the perfect thing immediately unless you have already done it before. So like you shouldn't like overthink it too much. You should just do it, and you will like iterate.
And it also ties into the last point of the mindset stuff, which was we would like to make many games, and we talked about this a bit earlier in the podcast too. But since we're here for the long term, right? The long arc of history is going to show that we made 1 billion games or something. We have to keep improving so that we can continue making stuff that's better in the future. And a lot of people have this model in mind where it's just you make one game like League of Legends or whatever, and you just keep updating that game. But as we mentioned in the second episode, we want to make many games, and we want all of them to be good in their own right. But there are also crystallizations of the skills that we had and the tools that we had at the time. And I think that's enough. Like, that's enough to know, hey, we have significantly improved over the course of the creation of a few games. Like this time in 10 years or in 5 years, if we have a couple games under our belt by 5 years, if we have, whatever, that's good. Like, it'll be nice. Obviously there's like an element of this where you get anxiety about like how long it will take to build all these projects. But I think if you even us aiming kind of low with our first game is still probably going to be the best idea, since Brood War, probably over Brood War as well. Like,
Yeah.
It's kind of weird and maybe a little sad to think about it that way, but I don't think it's impossible. Like, it's not like the games industry has all these masterpieces, like we said before. It's not like there's these things that are completely out of reach. You just have to think a little bit outside the box, but also recognize what was good about the previous titles and what needs to be left behind.
Yeah.
And
I think this mindset with many games actually ties back, funnily enough, to a very ancient dot code that you made, which is called process over product. And I think I watched it like fucking 30 times. So
there you go.
over the years, but it's actually pretty good because it's like you were talking about how like the thing is just the thing that it produces is the crystallization of your skill, and it's good that way because if you just never leave it, you sort of like you cannibalize your process for that just so the thing is just like a little bit better,
Right.
and it's not really that useful, and it's better to just keep on improving and improve the process.
I have realized that maybe branding all of my really educational / motivational philosophical videos that actually do add value to people when they listen to them as dad caw might not have been the best choice, because I don't think that many people are going to take that seriously, but that's okay, man. It's a filter, and it just lets you know who's really serious about improving. I don't know. That's a good one. I'll see if I can link that in the description too for people who are interested. It is an old one, but the concepts within it are still pretty good. I think when you think about it, like the not lingering on one thing for too long, and moving around and stuff, it's kind of the opposite of what we've done, because we've stayed with this one Brood War mod for a long time. But now we're getting into building this engine layer and then building a couple games. Like, if we can release a few, I think that'll be enough. And if the games are good, which they will be, and if the content within them is replayable, which of course it will be, like, that is probably going to be enough to sustain it for the goings. As long, like, we don't need to constantly do maintenance and stuff. Even though there's multiplayer to it, it's going to be peer-to-peer, right? So we don't have to worry about like server costs. It would be nice to get like matchmaking eventually, or like ladder stats and whatnot, but I don't know that that's something that we need to worry about for our first game, or maybe our first few games, depending on how things go. Like, we want to get enough experience under our belts before we build a game that's like deliberately trying to, not that we're trying to make an esport ever, but like games which have enough of the enough of a backbone to work with that. I guess really, if there's enough grassroots interest in one of our games, like even Onatar, which isn't designed as a game that's like, here's our epic multiplayer PvP game, it's more like there's an option for it, but it's not like the main focus. If say there's like a big interest in that, some fan somewhere will build a leaderboard and build a server for it, or whatever, or use a server for it, or whatever. Like, honestly, we can just offload that there. We don't need it. It's not required for the game to be good. It's not required for the game to have long-term success. It's just something that will naturally occur. It would be great if we could have support for that ourselves, if maybe we make enough money off of some of these games to actually do that. But it's and that's something we just haven't explored much, but it's also not something that we are like building into the spec of these games until later. When we get to Cosmonarchy Retail, when we get to Zabalba titles, those are the games we want to actually have room for competition, even if it's not like a whole big esports scene or whatever. It's just the idea of like, yeah, you can play on the ladder and you can play against players that are like as good as you, and you can really test your skills in that sense. Like, that's the kind of thing we want eventually. So we got to build up to that so that we know how to do that properly. Because then that also ensures, makes it so that we have to make sure we have a good anti-cheat. We have to make sure we have a good ladder system and matchmaking and like all the stuff that it's related to game development, but it's like kind of ancillary and takes away from your focus on content and whatnot. And we don't need to worry about all of those things at once. So I think this approach makes a lot of sense, because eventually we'll have enough competence in the stuff that is like common between the games, so that we can now start to explore stuff that's completely new to this one game that's specific to whatever we're trying to make. So I think that's pretty neat. And I think we're good. So of course, we will be back again with another episode of this, probably ideally next month, early February or something. Maybe we can talk a little bit more about the development that we've done, but we can also talk about some of the changes to Cosmonarchy Brood War, the aforementioned mod / conversion we've been working on for a while. There was a recent update to try a new tech segmentation model, so we can tease that we will be doing some talking about that. There will be some reflection, because we'll have more games to look at. Yeah. And I've started uploading castovers of replays. So if you're interested in how the PvP looks for that kind of environment, then you can check those out on my own channel. And there are a few other things here. Obviously, I mentioned the Substack, but we also, Raffle and I have started a coffee page. So that's ko-fi. There will be a link in the description. And that's just if you're interested in supporting us financially, even just for a small amount of money, one-off or what,
you can
then
you can hand us threes.
Yes, you pay us in threes, which is just a ridiculous channel meme that has somehow spawned into the people giving me what is it? Multiplicatives? Whatever, variants of three.
Multiplicatives of
Yeah,
three.
yeah, and that's just
Multiples.
insane. So it's also not a number that is elegantly split in half, which is funny because like it's 50-50 between the two of us. It's pretty stupid, but it's 3. So if you feel like $3 a month is a good deal,
to have.
go ahead.
Maybe we still have we used to have 69 coffees on the page, so that was pretty funny.
Yeah, well, the big numbers are always funny. And shout out to the people who did send their support, big or small. There you go.
Yeah,
the one thing I will say too, I'll say that one of the perks of doing this is that if you give us any amount per month, then we will accept your questions to talk about on this show. So that's another reason to bring it up. It's not just, hey, give us money. Obviously, this is totally optional. I'll link a video that explains it a little bit in more detail if you're interested, but hopefully people don't get the wrong idea from us doing it, but you can never control how people respond. You can only control what you do. And I think we'll demonstrate that we're using the money well because we're investing it right back into being able to work on the stuff that you guys are all waiting for. So that's nice. And yeah, if you have questions and you have already given us money, then ask those questions and we will respond to them on this show in the next episode. And other than that, I think, I don't know if you have any final words, Mr. Veeq7, but that is it, I think.
It's been pretty good.
Pretty good episode, and it will close now. So thanks for hopping on in with me today for this, almost 1.5 hour episode. And we will be back soon. We'll continue the content train, continue the game development, window and engine development train as well. So looking forward to continuing to blow people's minds with the kinds of things that we can do, because despite the fact that it is just a jank Brood War mod, somehow CMBW ends up being the most satisfying RTS experience a lot of people have had, and I think that's a nice little omen of what's to come. So see you guys soon.
Yeah, bye.